Hello fellow prospectors, my name is Manachender and welcome to another Icarus video. The game has officially been out for a week now, and to be perfectly honest, I've kind of lost myself in it. So today I'm dragging myself out of my drop pod to bring you some tweaks I've made to my hardware and graphics settings in order to make the game run smoothly. For context, my gaming PC is not top of the line, but it certainly exceeds the minimum specs for the game. I'm running a stock Ryzen 9 3900X at 3.8 GHz, 32GB of 3200 MHz RAM, and a GeForce 2080 Super. The game is also installed on a 2TB Western Digital Black Gen4 NVMe drive, with my OS and page file running on a 500GB Samsung Evo 970 Gen 3 NVMe drive. My gaming display is a 1440p 144Hz MSI curved display, so the main thing there to note is the resolution. From my perspective, I feel that Rocketworks and Nvidia did an amazing job optimizing the game for release, at least compared to the last few beta weekends. And the Game Ready driver released the day before the game has done wonders for my performance, although I have talked to some people who have had the opposite experience. After some tweaking with the in-game options on release, I have found that I've got the game to an acceptable performance level, at least for myself and my own preference for how I play games. So here are my 4 top tips for helping to improve your play experience, or at least for you to consider. So first off is the install location. With modern gamers demanding more and more realistic games, it means that textures and sounds need to be more detailed, higher resolution, and just more. And all of these need to be installed on your system in order for the game to access them. The bigger a texture, the more space it requires, and the longer it takes to load. In older games, a list of all the textures would be included for each level when it loads, and only those textures would actually be loaded into memory, and then dumped from the memory at the end of the level to make space for the next level. True open world games, however, don't really have loading screens beyond the initial one. This means that the game needs to be able to load and dump textures when needed, and seamlessly. In Icarus, you might drop into the forest biome, but then walk to the desert biome. This means that the game needs to initially load the textures for your visible surroundings in the forest, then eventually the desert when you get there, and also everything in between. There's no point in the game storing textures for a bear if there are no bears around, for example. This means that there's more space in memory for the tree textures, or the grass, or the rocks, so they can be slightly more detailed. However, when the game detects that you've wandered into an area with said bear, it needs to load the textures required to render it from your hard drive, pass it to the GPU, and then render that. And this requires time. Time for your CPU to tell your hard drive it needs the textures, time for the hard drive to locate them, time to read the data, and then more time to pass that to the CPU and then on to the GPU. This is where the type and speed of the hard drive you install the game to comes into play. There's no point having a 5GHz 16-core CPU and an RTX 3090 if you have the game installed on your slow platter drive. It would be like having a single-lane dirt path being the only road onto your brand new 5-lane highway. Your graphics card can only render as fast as it can get the data to render, and if it takes half a second to get the textures it needs, you will constantly experience low frame rate, or at least inconsistent frame rate. Installing modern games onto a modern solid-state drive over a platter drive can sometimes improve your overall gameplay experience compared to upgrading your graphics card or CPU to the latest and greatest there is to offer. In terms of modern gameplay experience, sometimes moving from a platter drive to a solid-state drive can get you a better frame rate increase over jumping up 1 or 2 generations of CPU or GPU. Additionally, the game's Discord server has people constantly complaining about the extended patching times when updates are made to the game. While this is unfortunately a known issue with how Unreal Engine games are updated, you can minimize this time by ensuring that the game is installed on a solid-state drive, and also that the default Steam install path is also on the same drive. Now we're moving into the actual graphics configuration on your computer. This is before we even look at the game configuration itself. Both Nvidia and AMD have features on their cards and drivers to allow you to use idle cycles to prepare future frames in order to possibly smooth out your frame rate. The term for this is pre-rendered frames, and can help provide a smoother experience for most gamers. Some games handle this internally as long as your GPU is set to allow them, which is the default setting for both NVIDIA and AMD. So there can't really be anything wrong with this, can there? Well, yes, there can actually be quite a lot wrong with it. Gamers who are unaware that their cards are doing this will find that it's one of the biggest causes of input lag in their games. I might press space to make my character jump, but if the GPU has already rendered, say, the next 15 frames, I won't see my character actually jump until the 16th frame. At a normal 60 frames per second, that's a full quarter of a second. While modern game engines might not allow my GPU to have that many spare cycles to render that many frames in advance, you will find that some picky gamers could even notice a lag of 3 or 4 frames. The less pre-rendered frames you have, the more responsive your game will feel for both keyboard and mouse input. Additionally, pre-rendered frames will also have two main hardware drawbacks. It means your GPU is working harder and has very little idle time, therefore increasing the running temperature and potentially lowering the core clock speed due to thermal throttling. This will normally ramp up the fan speed and also the noise in the process. There's also an impact on the video RAM or VRAM performance on your graphics card. So when your GPU has pre-rendered multiple frames, it has to store them somewhere before they can be passed to your monitor. And this is obviously going to be your VRAM. If these frames are taking up memory on the GPU, it means that there is less available to store textures, increasing the loading demand from your hard drive, as covered in my previous point. Additionally, you might find that some games, like Icarus, have a setting internally to allocate a certain amount of VRAM specifically to use for storing textures, particle effects, and other graphical elements. In Unreal Engine 4 games like Icarus, this is called the texture streaming pool size. This means that you can then run into an issue where your pre-rendered frames are using vital VRAM, which your GPU needs to store the required assets to render the next frame, resulting in an out-of-video memory error and your game crashing. While this is not the only cause of the out-of-video memory error, it can be one possible one, so making sure that your pool size within games like Icarus is not set too high, and also ensuring that the pre-rendered frames are limited, you can reduce the chances of this error happening. So, knowing that there is both an input lag and potentially a game-breaking memory issue, why would you want to use pre-rendered frames? Personally, I don't, which is why I have it turned off. You can disable this feature globally using your respective card's control panel, with low latency mode being for NVIDIA and flip queue size for AMD. While the ability to do this is baked into the NVIDIA control panel, it is a bit harder to do on the AMD side. You might need to go hunting for a third-party tool or change it within the registry, something you should never do unless you know exactly what you're actually doing. So on to my third point, which is, while Icarus is a really good looking game, it can sometimes go a bit overboard with some of the eye candy. The forest biomes are especially guilty of this. The foliage setting in the game controls really two things. Firstly, the draw distance of any interactable flora which isn't a fully grown tree, and secondly, the non-interactable layer of vegetation on the ground. In the desert, this is mainly the grass, which is sporadic, but in the forest it's basically most of the green items on the ground, and there are a lot. On screen you can see a comparison of how each of the four foliage settings look, and while the low setting might look the cleanest by removing the leaves and grass on the ground, it also vastly reduces the distance at which you can see other flora, like the cluster of wheat in the center of the screen, which completely disappears under the low setting. In fact, you need to move pretty close to the wheat in order for it to load in, meaning that you can very easily miss it if you're running around specifically looking for it. However, these are the default settings for the base game. Since it's an Unreal Engine game, there are some additional options which are not in the settings screen, but which can be applied to the game engine via modifying the engine.ini file. On screen right now, you can see a comparison of how one of these settings can change the look of the game. The foliage is set to the same low settings in both of the clips. The first clip is from the base unmodified setting, and the second has the foliage.lod distance scale setting modified to 3, which gives the interactable flora the same draw distance as setting it to epic. It gives a really good balance of removing the clutter, but also letting you see anything you might want to pick up. There are also some other tweaks you can make using this file, but I'll leave that up to you to find out since they're not really part of the intended design of the game. However, Google is your friend. One other benefit of a modern game is that modern graphics features can also be shown off. Features like ray tracing, global illumination, and deep learning supersampling, or DLSS, definitely add a lot to the game, although some users might not notice their effects right away or even care. Additionally, these are only available for anyone using an RTX card, and they can be quite expensive. AMD card users are currently left out due to not being able to use the ray tracing and global illumination, but they are able to use Fidelity FX Super Resolution, or FSR, which is AMD's version of DLSS. On top of this, ray tracing and global illumination are limited to DirectX 12 only, while DLSS and FSR can be turned on under both 11 or 12. On screen, you can see a direct comparison between DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 on my hardware, with ray tracing and global illumination turned off under DirectX 12. And as you can see, there is practically no difference in frame rate between the two, so why would I not run DirectX 12? And what exactly is the impact of switching on ray tracing and global illumination? It drops my frame rate by about 50%, as you can see on the screen. It is still playable, but these are really just eye candy, and having them turned off will have very little visual impact unless you want to look at all the pretty. Personally, I prefer to have a higher, smoother frame rate more than the eye candy. One interesting thing to note though is the GPU usage numbers while toggling between the foliage settings with ray tracing and global illumination turned on. Turning the foliage to low does increase the frame rate from around 50 to 80 or 60% increase, but it also brings the GPU usage up from around 70% to full 99%. This seems to be because the actual rendering is being held back by the tensor cores on the ray tracing. It would be really interesting to see if anyone with an RTX 3 series card might be experiencing the same thing. Unfortunately, I don't have access to one of those cards. So if you are running ray tracing and global illumination, you will probably need to find a happy medium between the foliage detail and an acceptable frame rate. Medium foliage with ray tracing and global illumination on for me still gives a good 60 frames a second. However, based on the last point, there is the option of turning off the clutter while still leaving the full draw distance on. So those are my 4 main points for how I got Icarus to run at an acceptable level for myself on my hardware and at my gaming resolution. Everything, as you could see, was on Epic, with Foliage being the only exception. Some prospectors might want more eye candy, others might not have the hardware to get anywhere near that, and others might not be experiencing the same improvements that I had with the game-ready drivers. Yes, the hardware requirements for Icarus are pretty high, but if I can get it running this well with everything on Epic on hardware which is over 2 years old, it should be pretty easy to get acceptable performance on hardware which is just slightly older. The downside is that unfortunately this is the norm for modern PC gaming. Every few years a game comes along which pushes hardware to its limits and makes us all wish we could just go out and grab the best hardware we can get. Unfortunately, this is not quite possible today with the global situation, and even if we did have the funds to do it, we just have to make do with what we have. On that note, folks, I'll end this here. Hopefully you've gained something from this video, and as always, leave a like and subscribe if you want. I can be found on the Icarus Discord under the same name I have here, so feel free to hit me up on there or leave a comment below. And remember, don't feed the raccoons.